Today we are going to look at diffusion and active transport. I'm going to spend a little less time on diffusion because there is a video in B2 for this process. We're going to look a little more at active transport and what it is and where it's important. Now the first thing to look at would be to look at a cell that comes from a living thing. It could be from any living thing, any plant, any animal. I've just chosen this runner to pluck a cell from, and when we look at the cell, one thing that's quite important to know and realize about the cell is that it needs to be able to transport substances in and out. And examples of some of these substances would be something like oxygen. This needs to go into the cell for the process of respiration, and this would be usually by diffusion. So oxygen can diffuse in from an area where there's a high concentration to a lower concentration, down a concentration gradient, we would say. But that's oxygen, and that's one example of a substance. Something else might be water. And as we know from a previous video, water can move by osmosis. And again, we've looked at that previously, so there's a video on that if you want to see that. But water moves in by osmosis. It actually might also move out depending on the concentration of the solutions inside and outside of the cell. But there are also other substances that need to go in, and one example might be something like glucose. Glucose is an important molecule required for respiration, and it can actually go into the cell by diffusion, but sometimes we get a situation where the glucose molecules are in a lower concentration on the outside than they are on the inside. So the natural process here might be for the glucose to diffuse out again because there's a higher concentration on the inside, but that actually is blocked from happening. The glucose can't go back out again, but there is a problem in that there is not a diffusion gradient to allow the glucose to travel in. So in this case we need another process, and that process is active transport. And active transport is a method by which glucose, or in fact a whole variety of particles, can be moved against a concentration gradient. And because they're moving against a concentration gradient, the key thing is that we need energy. So if we were to look at what we mean by active transport, here's a slightly better way of putting it. We've got the movement of particles, and we don't have to use the word particles. Sometimes we say ions or molecules, depending on the exact example we're looking at. They're moving from an area of low concentration to an area of high concentration. Again, we can say that's against a concentration gradient. And an important point to mention is that energy is required from respiration. Sometimes you might hear about a substance called ATP, which is produced from respiration, and it's a quick release energy molecule. But the key point here is energy is required from respiration. So this is what you might talk about or write about if you were asked what actually active transport is. Another example that we can give, quite a common example, is the active transport of ions into root hair cells. If I was to take a root hair cell from this plant, obviously from the root, this has the job of absorbing water by osmosis, but it also has the job of absorbing mineral ions, which are required in small concentrations by the plant. There is often the case where the mineral ions will be in higher concentration in the cell compared to the outside of the cell. There are only small amounts usually found in the soil, and therefore these would need to be brought in, but because again the concentration gradient is in the wrong direction for diffusion, it would have to be done by active transport. So that's another common example of what's talked about. Other areas where it happens is the active transport of glucose back into the kidney, into the blood from the kidney tubules. So glucose in kidneys, and that's reabsorption of glucose. We'll look at that in more detail in a later video. Another example again is glucose, and that's from the products of digestion in the small intestine. So in the small intestine, if you've had a meal that you've had some sugars, carbohydrates in there, they'll be broken down into glucose, and they will diffuse into the blood. The glucose will diffuse into the blood to start off with, but however, not all of the glucose can be brought in by this way. So active transport is a very important process required to get that glucose into the blood. The last thing I want to cover is an application of this kind of idea of active transport. We've got a plant here that's growing in some nutrient solution. So this is water with some mineral ions in it, or it might have some mineral ions in it that's required by the plant, and you might see something like a graph that looks a bit like this, and the question might be, or it might be related to something like, we've got the rate of respiration measured on the x-axis, on the y-axis there, sorry, the rate of respiration over a period of time, and at some point we can see that mineral ions are added, and as we add the mineral ions, the rate of respiration starts to increase. Why is that? Well, it's all linked to what we've just been talking about. Mineral ions in solution here are usually brought in by active transport, and if we're using active transport, we require energy, and if we require energy, we require respiration. And another thing that could be linked into this as well is the presence of mitochondria. As you know, mitochondria have the function of releasing energy from respiration, so there might be plenty of those that are available, and it might be linked into a question to do with active transport in that way. Okay, so that's an overview of active transport, a couple of examples and possibly an application of the process. That's me done for now. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you again soon.